Fabian Ziermann, Ayşe, Gizem, Yasar, Eli Pales. Very much welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. We will be discussing today a very important and very new issue. It's new for people, most of whom have this stereotypical perception of video gaming as something kind of lazy with a bottle, is open can of Coca-Cola, and the reality is by far much more advanced and colorful. Video gaming is taking over. It is so omnipresent, and it's important. It's hard to overestimate. And you are three remarkable specialists who would help us to navigate in this labyrinth. And obviously, our focus is digital markets and competition law, antitrust law, but we could obviously go beyond. And I propose to start with the first round, maybe just to remind to us of the very importance of video games from the economic perspective, maybe societal as well. And why wouldn't we start with you, Fabian?
Yeah, I mean, economically speaking, why should we care about video games? In antitrust law, we're speaking about Google every day. Search engines are everywhere. If you look at the market size right now, the market for search engines is valued at 192 billions. And we're talking about it all the time. Video games are valued at 250 billion and supposed to grow to 390 in 2028. And search engines, for example, only go up to 255 billion. So it's a bigger market, but we don't really care as much about it because we don't understand it. And with Microsoft Activision, we obviously saw the problems by the authorities. Like every authority struggled to come up with a theory of harm because they didn't really understand the market.
That's a very nice first punch. Ayşe, do you want to continue on this?
Thanks, Ayse, and thanks for inviting us. I'm very, very happy to be here. Yeah, I mean, I completely echo everything Fabian said. And as you know, I am part of a team that works at Glasgow's Create on the games industry and virtual worlds. And one of the key aspects of the gaming industry that makes it very different from other digital markets is the role of the user. It's a very, very interactive market. And often our preconceptions of innovation as antitrust scholars or practitioners don't apply here. I mean, the supply chains are way more complicated, or I mean, even calling it a supply chain seems a bit bizarre because the users play such an important role from also non-commercial aspects here. And, you know, we have music industry mixed up in here, indie game publishers, large game publishers. So it's very difficult to put this all together and create, you know, for example, a one-size-fits-all market definition or delineate the boundaries of, you know, whatever it is that we are looking at from a competition or antitrust perspective.
Thank you very much, Ayşe.
I think one of the reasons a lot of people don't necessarily pay attention as much is because they're not aware of the consequences, or they don't think the consequences are as bad. Everyone, when it comes to the search engine market, will understand that if there's not enough competition, then there could be problems with privacy in terms of the terms that people are entering into the platform. There could be problems with misinformation and other consequences that people see as stark. With video games, I think a lot of people, especially policymakers who are mostly much older, don't really recognize the consequences of agglomeration, which is significant. I think that it's also important to recognize that the video game market is not just big in size, but is now progressively larger in terms of the demographics. And so it used to be video games, something that was really centralized among men or boys and younger men. And now what we're seeing is there's almost gender parity in the market. There's just as many women almost playing games as men. And there's a lot of much greater age parity as well. And even though the oldest individuals are still not as high, playing games at such a high rate as younger people, and that's maybe why policymakers have not been as responsive. Certainly when it comes to middle-aged cohort, there has been a large increase in the amount of gamers relative to in the past. So there's been huge growth across all these metrics.
And if we can narrow down the scope of our discussion, obviously the focus is on competition policy. And Fabian, what are the main elements of the relevance for of video gaming industry for competition policy? We obviously see elephant in the room, several maybe even related to merger control, but not only. Can you maybe very briefly outline or start outlining to us the relevance of video gaming and competition policy?
Yeah, I mean, one major concern that we just had this week with the Google versus Epic case is the ecosystem orchestrator behaving in a way that's not so beneficial for other companies in the same market. So like the 30% tax. Now, if we think of video games, it's even worse. Every video game has its own ecosystem, which is controlled by the publisher. And then Ayşe already said the value of user-generated content. Everything that happens in the ecosystem ties back somehow to the game with user-generated content. The difference being, due to copyright, the publishers can shape the entire ecosystem and kind of do whatever they want. So, for instance, if we would say self-preferencing for Google, yes, it modifies the algorithm, it owns the algorithm, but if it modifies it, it's still self-preferencing. In gaming, if the publisher does something with, let's say, content that was created by streamers, they can just say, well, it's our copyright. You're infringing, actually, so we can do whatever we want. That's a big issue for competition policy to, first of all, kind of control what the publisher can do intra-ecosystem, and then also what happens inter-ecosystem with other publishers. So like a big concern in Microsoft Activision was, how do we look at the market? And what the commission in the end ultimately did was like look at weird markets like AAA shooter games. So AAA, AAA being like the most valuable games. There's no such market for AAA shooter games. Like if you ask people what they play, they're not going to name 3 or 2 AAA shooter games because that doesn't exist. There's no competition in that direct sense, but more like a subgenre market, for instance, where games compete with each other. So let's say battle royale shooters where you have 2 or 3 games that are almost entirely identical, but like the creativity and the artistry in the game is a bit different. And that's the actual plane of competition. So for instance, one interesting point by the commission that was kind of strange was that they looked at the telemetry data from players from the PlayStation. So essentially they said, okay, let's look at the PlayStation for, I don't know, Fabian, what did he play? Which genre? 50% this, 20% that, 10% that. Now, make an example of how strange that actually is. If we, for instance, consider mobile phones and we look at some sort of market for the mobile phone or what happens on the mobile phone, then we would say Tinder is competing with PayPal, with Facebook, with the calculator app, with our banking app, because we all use them on the same platform. It doesn't make sense whatsoever, but that's the approach we took in gaming. So there are major issues still to be resolved.
Ayşe, do you concur with this diagnosis that we are too unarticulated with defining markets, relevant product markets within this industry?
I agree with you, Fabian, but there's one thing that I want to pick up on from what you said. And actually, you know what I'm going to say because you were at our roundtable back in March in Glasgow. One of the themes that emerged there is this idea of walled gardens or, closed ecosystems is that they do, for example, Apple, they do actually commission games from smaller developers, and the revenues generated thanks to this walled garden system actually helps indie developers to flourish in a way. So from their perspective, one thing that emerged in that roundtable, and this was echoed in our most recent discussion in November, is that this isn't necessarily a bad thing for smaller players. And something else that I wanted to add to this is from the perspective of virtual worlds, because this is what I mainly focus on beyond gaming. So we can call this beyond gaming, or building on gaming, or taking gaming one step further. And this is something related to also to the Digital Markets Act, because you know, now we have, in the antitrust world, we hear a lot about interoperability. In technical terms, it's very, very difficult to achieve. Even we see it with DMA in terms of messaging services. But when it comes to virtual worlds, this seems to be the approach the Commission, the European Commission, is starting to push for. They published a call for evidence back in July about interoperability in virtual, I mean, pushing for interoperability in virtual worlds. But in practice, for us antitrust scholars, a big question is, of course, who's going to set the rules of this game? So first of all, I mean, it's very difficult to achieve in practice, but going beyond that, if this were to be achieved, there has to be, I mean, at least based on our preliminary discussions with industry participants, who's going to set the rules of the game? And immediately we face this problem of, do we have, you know, a so-called monopoly who is going to define what you know, interoperability means in this context? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayşe. Eli, please.
Yeah, I guess I would push back a little bit about the presentation of the walled garden approach in terms of a benefit. I think this is actually one of the issues when we have in competition. And what we see, for example, I'll bring up Game Pass. Game Pass is a monthly subscription service. It's a lot like Netflix in the sense that an individual pays $10 a month and gets access to a catalog of, you know, hundreds of games. And a lot of developers have come out and said that they, indie developers have come out and said that they really appreciate it, because essentially they get a lump sum of money and they don't need to go at the market and risk everything. So they take the guaranteed sum. And right now that works just fine because the game subscription service, while it's growing rapidly, that market, it's not the dominant market like, you know, streaming services are in the video space. And so a user still has an option whether they subscribe to a service or they go buy video games a la carte. And so that choice for a developer is real. What I fear is that as the subscription service market grows and people transition to that as their primary gaming place, that sort of choice won't exist anymore, in the sense that the user will have to choose a game subscription service as they choose right now a video streaming service, Netflix or Disney or whatever else. And once you have the market set up in such a way, then the developers no longer have a choice whether to go to the market and sell individual copies or whether to take a lump sum at this game subscription service. And at that point, I no longer feel like that is a benefit for the developers, because essentially you have a race to the bottom. Their only option at that point is to find a game subscription service that will take their game. And because there's so many inputs, there's so many different game developers trying to get onto a marketplace, because that is the only way to find their ways to a consumer, that gives a lot of bargaining power, a lot of leverage to companies like Microsoft who own Game Pass. Right now, we don't see that issue yet, but I fear that as the game subscription services grow bigger, and right now there really only are two big players, PlayStation and Xbox Game Pass, and that's it. That's where I really have large fears of monopoly, just in agglomeration generally.
So Microsoft and PlayStation appear to be two, not necessarily at the current 2023-24, but the prospects, the chances for them to homogenize the downstream services and to channel everything through their subscription services is high enough to entrench their dominance, their systemic position, and thus to channel the markets or shape the markets in this oligopolistic or duopolistic fashion in the future. Do I understand this correctly, Eli?
Yeah, and we know, so Game Pass, for example, right now is 25 million users. And there's actually, you know, some people would push back against what I'm saying, because Game Pass has actually stalled in growth. They haven't gained subscribers in a year or two now. So they've been stuck at 25 million. So maybe I'm being a little bit of too much of a doomer. Although I think that that Game Pass is currently a very good deal. And so I would be shocked if it didn't continue growing. But Game Pass has 60% market share right now, and they have 25 million users, and PlayStation is number 2. And so when you have two dominant players swallowing up that large of a market, then yeah, I believe as it grows, you're not going to have the ability of people to enter the market. And we have seen other game subscription services try sort of through the cloud space, offer streaming through the computer on a monthly fee basis. But those have been unsuccessful because fundamentally they don't have the infrastructure on the customer base, infrastructure on the hardware, and infrastructure in terms of getting games on their platforms to support their game subscription services. So I really do fear that could just be 2 or 3 players at the end of it all.
Yeah,
Thank
if
you
I
very
can-
much, Eli. Fabian, do you concur with this crystal ball gazing, or do you think it will be slightly different? And also, I wanted to ask you, you were quite skeptical about quite a popular, in this context, terminal or reference to cloud gaming as something which will somehow define the parameters of the entire business model in the future. And if I can ask you also reflect upon this, if you can.
Yeah, so I like the crystal ball approach. I tried playing with it myself today in preparation for this. I like that you bring up the user numbers for the Game Pass. I actually tried to play around with it a little different. If you look at the games that Microsoft offers, so for instance, Minecraft is in the Game Pass, but then when you look at the usage numbers for Minecraft, it tells you like 160,000 via Game Pass in Europe. And like, I know Minecraft's user numbers are somewhere in the millions, so I digged a little deeper. And I looked at all the games that can potentially be available now through the Game Pass, either from Microsoft itself, which it already owns, or which will now enter from Activision Blizzard. And if we look at that for Europe, we come to 147 million monthly active users. Doesn't sound like a lot, but if we consider that the European market has 190 million active users, then suddenly post-transaction now, Microsoft and Activision Blizzard have 60% of the monthly active user market in Europe. So like if we think about this for a second, the European Commission and the CMA just enabled Microsoft to become dominant. When did we like start facilitate dominance through mergers? Like this is an entirely new approach to me because usually we want to prevent it and not support it. Regarding cloud gaming, as I said in the preparation, I think it's completely overblown. It's a super small market and it doesn't really matter. So I've also tried to play around with that glass ball in the beginning and looked at mobile phones because mainly cloud gaming right now is interesting with the app stores and mobile phones that you download the cloud gaming app and then you can play all the games you want on your device. Nowadays, if you buy for like $200 to $250, you get a device that has 126 or 128 gigabyte storage. During the Microsoft Activision debate, it was said that usually users don't play more than 4 games actively at the same time. So like good game nowadays, which is really high level on a mobile phone, has about 3 to 10 gigabytes in storage requirements. So let's take 4 of those. Let's take the average. Then we're 26 gigabyte, which is 1/5 of your phone's memory at one time. Like cloud gaming would take away that 1/5 of your phone's memory. That's not really that much of a benefit. Most of our pictures are in the cloud anyways nowadays. We don't really need gaming to go there. Like there's no storage benefit. Now then if we look at, okay, we can play better games through the cloud, that doesn't really work. Internet latency is a massive problem that prevents that from really happening in a like useful way. So essentially we've blown this issue out of proportion because what I think happened is the authorities looked at the market in phase 1 and were like, yeah, there needs to be a problem here because they're paying 70 billion or close to 70 billion. And then they went first with input foreclosure, which was then solved by the licensing deals. And then they were in a haste to come up with something. And then somehow cloud gaming popped up and suddenly they jumped onto it. Now, for instance, Jost Riedfeld, he points out that cloud gaming is kind of one of 4 things. It's an input, it's a platform, or a feature in like a larger bundle. And that makes complete sense. It's like, it's not a distinct market, but it's like an additional product offering. Here, buy the Game Pass and you get 10 games via cloud gaming, via cloud game streaming. But you don't buy the Game Pass to get access to that. Like, it's just not that big of an issue.
Ayşe, what are your view on this cascade of problems?
For what it's worth, one thing that we came across, so I suppose we are looking at, bottlenecks at different levels of the supply chain. And one thing that came up, and this is this was triggered by the recent terms and conditions changes at Unity, but there's definitely, we might be looking at a fragmented system, for example, when we look at game developers, but still there are bottlenecks, and one of them is, in addition to Microsoft and Activision, in terms of user access, there are also bottlenecks at the development side. So, for example, it emerged that when Unity changed, Unity is a game development engine basically. So a lot of developers use that to practically develop games. And when they decided to, normally their business model in a nutshell is a licensing model, so a wholesale model. But now they decided to change this to a per download financing model. And this, as a result, a lot of game developers sort of panic, because so many of them depend on Unity to actually put their games on the market. And now it seems like these changes have been frozen for a while at least, but it remains to be seen what Unity is going to do, because it's, for example, it's a loss-making enterprise, so they do need to make money somehow. So now we might see yet another issue in the supply chain that will squeeze out independent developers even further.
Eli?
All right, so yeah, I guess a few points to address. In terms of the cloud gaming, I agree with Fabian's assessment generally that cloud gaming is pretty much a non-issue right now, and it's more of an included service and other things. I would change my diagnosis about why it hasn't been successful. I don't think that the problem is with internet power. I mean, most urbanites nowadays have download speeds of 100 megabits per second, or if not higher. It's certainly enough for game streaming. And I do think there are significant benefits to the fact that you could stream games that are at high technical fidelity that your phone would simply not be able to handle. I think the bigger thing is that right now gaming is the most affordable it's ever been. And you wouldn't think about that when you just look at a video game console and see, oh, the game console costs $400, or in euros, it's what, 400 euros. But I think that in reality, that's really not that. For the consumer today, they can afford that. When people are spending, $1,000 on an iPhone, spending $500, $400 on a video game console that they will use for 5 years is something that really is something they can afford. And so the cloud gaming service isn't nearly as necessary, because people can run their games locally on the hardware that they own. They don't need to offload the processing power to some server somewhere else. So I think that would be my diagnosis for why it hasn't really taken off. In terms of the infrastructure of Unity and other game engines, I absolutely agree that this is a place where I think there should be focus. From the competition perspective, for those that don't know, essentially game engines are the basis, the very infrastructure upon which video games are built. And I think the big fear with Unity when they change their policies about pricing is that so many game developers were not just planning to release their games on Unity, but they had already built much of their games on Unity, and rebuilding it entirely on a new game engine was something that wasn't practical. They would have to redo it entirely. It's as if you had built a house already 80% done with one material, and then they said, well, you have to redo it with another material. So it becomes very work intensive and not practical. And so when essentially these companies have so much bargaining power too in this relationship, because game developers depend on the infrastructure and know that they can't just rebuild their entire game after it's 80% done or whatnot. So I agree absolutely with that assessment that this is some place where there should be some attention paid, because there certainly is an imbalance of marketing power. And I also agree that a lot of these game engines right now are not super profitable yet, because they do offer a lot of free services or low-cost services for independent game developers and other things. And so there certainly should be a balance there.
Let me ask you a more concrete question. You have covered it in part in your previous answers, but specifically on the Microsoft Activision Blizzard merger. Do you support it? Do you criticize it? What are the main reasons? And what will be the main implications in your view? Fabian, let's start with you.
Do I support it? No, not at all. I think I've made that clear throughout every talk and publication that I've done in the last 1 to 2 years. I published my JClap article, I think about a year ago or so, when I said, like, we clearly need to prohibit this. This is not good. They're not paying 70 billion for a reason. What I based my finding on there was on a subgenre market definition. So if we look at genres, we have first-person shooter, which just means you run around and kill people, essentially. But you can also delineate that further. So let's say battle royale shooter, where it's like you're on a map with like 60 to 100 people, and the last one that survives wins. Or you go into more tactical shooters like Counter-Strike, for instance, where you're like 5 versus 5, which are both games are like cover shooting, but there's completely different gaming. Like you can't just take a person from Counter-Strike and put them in Fortnite and they'll will like perform equally well. It's a completely different skill set, and that's how kind of you have to evaluate it. In markets, we often look at substitutability. If you can't take one person out of one market and put them into the other without a massive switching cost, then obviously it's not supposed to be the same market. Because both involve shooting, that doesn't mean that it's the same market. Now, if we look at like some of the market shares that the commission identified throughout the genre markets that it looked at, was like 30 to 40% market share, 20 to 30% market share, 40 to 50% market share with a genre market definition. So if we now apply a subgenre market definition, these market shares are going to be much higher, as well as what we already talked about with the Game Pass monthly active users, that they're somewhere in the region of 60%. So first of all, we're creating a dominant undertaking. We never want to do that anyways in competition law. And the second issue is the impediment to innovation. Essentially, what has happened with this transaction is that many games many games within a genre are owned by one company. So think about if, let's say, Google were to buy Bing. Do we really think that they would continue operating Bing? There's no benefit to it. They would be capturing their own value from Google search, and it would cannibalize each other. The same goes for these games. There's like Elder Scrolls and there's World of Warcraft. There's no incentive for the company to be super innovative in both. Or if we look at things like metaverse development, previously both these companies were placed super well, or as Ayşe said, virtual worlds, to develop something like that. Now they'll only develop one of these things because they would otherwise cannibalize each other's sales. So first, we created a dominant position, and secondly, we kind of ruined the innovation for years to come.
Ayşe, how would you reflect upon this merger?
So I can pick up on where Fabian left off, because I was following your comments on this metaverse aspect of the merger, actually, Fabian, because this is, again, what I focus on in the project. The thing is, I agree with you. I mean, Microsoft and Activision Blizzard, they boast quite similar infrastructures, actually, like World of Warcraft versus Minecraft. And the thing is, yeah, ultimately, the fact that there are fewer infrastructures where users can create virtual worlds means they're limited in terms of what they can do in this space. I mean, maybe we don't need to use the word metaverse because of the negative hype around it, thanks to Facebook/Meta. But if you think about virtual world development, I think at least in these initial stages, because we are looking at a very nascent space, obviously, and in these initial stages, I'm all for multiplicity of platforms where users, find ways to express themselves, because we're going one step further than games. We are looking at things where people actually create avatars for themselves. I mean, in a way that is very similar to games, but where we do more than several things. We could potentially live a lot of our lives in these virtual worlds. Whether we should is a different question, but at least at the outset, I'm all for multiplicity, and the idea that two massive players that actually currently, thanks to their gaming strength, have the structures to actually enable user creativity are brought together. Of course, I'm completely skeptical about that. But we will see how how things emerge, because they're also it's too early to tell, because there are also other players now, newer players who weren't active in the game space, who are coming out with these infrastructures to build virtual worlds, and we'll see to what extent they'll be able to. I don't want to use the word competition, but they will be able to provide a degree of multiplicity and diversity to users as we move towards virtual worlds, basically.
Thank you very much, Ayşe. Eli.
Yeah, so I guess it'd be interesting first to, I guess, set context for the merger, in the sense that Microsoft has the Xbox brand, and their top competitor is pretty much PlayStation. And going into the merger, which I also oppose, I guess we're sort of unanimous on that, or opposed to, because it pretty much is happening. But Xbox was pretty much in a place where they were consistently losing to PlayStation. Several generations, they were behind PlayStation in terms of console sold, in terms of revenue, in terms of all of these metrics. And they were having difficulty competing. And not just that, but they were having difficulty growing an organic development base. PlayStation is known, and Nintendo too, although that's sort of a different class of competitor, was known for its in-house game development studios, and it was efficiently producing games. Microsoft had far fewer studios, and really their only out was acquiring, because they couldn't grow them organically, or failed to grow them organically, or for whatever reason couldn't. So you have this imbalance. For many years, the vast majority of years, PlayStation is doing better than Microsoft, and they're desperate. And another big factor is the fact that a lot of games are pretty much handled on an exclusive basis. So what would happen without a merger is that a developer, for example, Activision, would develop a game, and then PlayStation or Microsoft could pay to get exclusivity. That usually involves a lump sum payment. The thing is that PlayStation, with having more users and selling more consoles, usually would have to pay less for exclusivity than Microsoft. So for example, if PlayStation has 100 million units and Microsoft is 40 million units out, PlayStation, because there's less cost associated with going exclusive on PlayStation's console, because they're giving up Xbox, which is a smaller company, PlayStation essentially had to pay less to acquire exclusive games than Xbox. And from the way that Xbox talked about it, which I sort of buy into, they felt that their only out was not a la carte purchasing of games, because that would always be far more expensive than for PlayStation and unsustainable, but essentially to buy the entire studio altogether to get the processing. Now, it's understandable that they felt that their back was against the wall. They were losing competitively for many years, and that was their only out. But of course, from the competition standpoint, it's very unfortunate that, as Fabian points out, they decided to just acquire their way to the top rather than be forced to innovate, because that's how the market is theoretically supposed to work in that situation, when their back is up against the wall and they're losing. They're supposed to figure it out, essentially, and build up the studio base to compete well. And so it's really unfortunate that the government, all of our governments from Europe, the UK, and America has pretty much allowed it, although I guess in America our government really tried to stop it. But the courts didn't allow, essentially allowed it to proceed. It's unfortunate that this was the outcome. As I mentioned in the past, I'm afraid about the Game Pass implications. I'm afraid about the fact that I really do think that these monthly subscription services are the future of premium games, not necessarily free-to-play games, which are mostly on the mobile market, but in terms of the premium games, ones that cost $10, $20, $60 to buy, I really do think that the subscription services are the future. And I'm afraid that Microsoft's going to continue consolidating in that respect, and be essentially the only marketplace or only place for indie developers to get their games to consumers. And that's a risk long term. How that's addressed, I'm not entirely sure.
Let me just add this on this juncture, because of this surprising consensus among three of you, and as a matter of disclaimer, can I ask you if you have any interest in this, apart from purely intellectual, so to say? You don't represent any industry. That's your kind of views, yeah?
I mean, I would say my interest is that, you know, I was a video game journalist for a while and then went to law school and all that. I think my interest is as a gamer, someone who really loves the industry and plays a lot of games consistently throughout the year. It'd be really sad for me if the industry was weakened or if we didn't have an output of creative games. I really do believe it is a strong artistic medium. And I've really fought with a lot of people throughout my life for the validation of this being a great industry and one that contributes a lot to the world. So I believe in it significantly, and it's really unfortunate when I see a threat to the industry as a whole. I guess one other point I forgot to make, and I hope it's okay, is that I think there's been a huge disconnect in this acquisition between the academic types like us and those of regular gamers. And as someone who has a lot of connections in the industry, I saw a huge disconnect between my own views and those of them. And one of the big reasons is because, as I've said several times now, Game Pass, the game subscription service, is such an incredible deal. A lot of consumers, what they see is just the next few steps in front of them. What they see is, oh, we're going to get a bunch of games that are added to the service that I pay $10 a month for, and I'm going to be able to play them for essentially free. These are games that otherwise would cost $60 or $70, and I'm getting them for $10 a month. How incredible of a deal is that? Call of Duty, Activision, all these other games, the Elder Scrolls. So from their standpoint, there's been a lot of the consumers have been significantly in favor because they see direct benefits as a result of the acquisition without thinking further down the line, as I think we have all done through our research about the consequences, downstream consequences, 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line. And so I think that's also been an unfortunate disconnect because a lot of consumers obviously are not primed on thinking that far ahead. What they see is what is in front of them, and they see the immediate tangible benefits. And especially in America, where our whole basis of antitrust law is based off the consumer welfare standard and about, you know, benefits to consumers, it became a lot more difficult to make the argument against the merger because so many consumers were in favor and it was portrayed as a pro-consumer move.
Excellent. Fabian, Ayşe, you don't have anything to disclose specifically? No, I imagine.
No, I don't. And I just want to say, as a caveat, I'm not a gamer, but my co-authors, my 3 co-authors are avid gamers, so I learned a lot from them. I came into this with a sort of a philosophical curiosity about the building of virtual worlds. You know, we're going into I thought we were going to a, you know, different type of engagement with games, but I was really fascinated by the role of the user ultimately once we delved into this. And Eli, I want to say this is maybe one space where we can't say consumer. We really can't, we really maybe shouldn't say consumer from an antitrust perspective, because this is where the user, it goes beyond user generated content in the sense of YouTube. It's not just people, you know, recording themselves and putting something online. It's very much about a co-creation process between the user and the, you know, the companies at various levels. So, and yeah. Again, this was my curiosity. This has been my curiosity.
Yeah, I also only have to disclose that I'm a gamer, or was a gamer when I had more time. Now I'm just looking at it from the academic perspective, and then I couldn't agree more what Ayşe said with the co-creation.
And we obviously have another landmark case just adjudicated by a jury earlier this week. And it's a saga where Epic Games tries to challenge the situation with app stores. It tried it with Apple, now it tries it with Google. So Fabian, I shift the floor to you, please. Can you remind us the main facts of the case?
Yeah, so obviously Epic doesn't want to pay the 30% tax, be it in the Google Play Store or in the Apple App Store. So they sued against both, against Apple and against Google. They lost against Apple in the appeals court in 9 out of 10 points. So like the anti-steering provision that you can't tell users within the app that you can purchase stuff elsewhere. So for instance, Epic Games was doing that to just go somewhere else, visit a website, buy something, and then just enter the code in the game itself. And then you can bypass the 30% tax. And obviously Apple didn't like that because it's a big revenue. Gaming is the biggest revenue for the app stores. And they actually won 9 out of 10 counts, except that one that you can't have alternative payment. And now they're appealing to the Supreme Court for that. So we'll see how that goes. And I think on Monday was the decision, Google versus Epic, where the case this time not just before one judge was in front of a jury, and the jury got 11 questions from the judge, and these were mainly yes and no answer questions. So it was like, do you think there's a restraint of trade? Yes. Do you think Google has a monopoly of in one market? Yes, which market? And then they said, I think it was the Android app distribution market worldwide, excluding China, and the Android in-app billing services for digital goods and services transactions worldwide, excluding China again. And now the judge will determine the legal consequences that follow from that. I was listening to a podcast from Ruprecht Potzun and Justus Haukapp earlier today, and they were talking about how brilliant is that? We just have 11 yes or no questions and we're done with an antitrust case in 4 hours. Maybe we need that kind of speedy enforcement. But again, it's a long road ahead. This will obviously go to the appeals court after, and then it will probably go to the Supreme Court if either of them doesn't like the outcome. So we're still a long way from having anything solid.
Please pass to Ruprecht and Justus our sincere congratulations on their remarkable job, and we beg English-speaking community, beg them to make more often their fantastic episodes also in English. Ayşe, I shift the floor to you, please.
Thank you very much, Oles. I mean, I don't have, I suppose I'm still processing this judgment, but one thing that I want to say, and this was also a topic during the whole Apple versus Epic case, and I'm quoting discussions with my friend and colleague Friso Boston here, who works a lot on basically the whole App Store issues, terms and conditions and fees. One big question, of course, is, do courts want to be fee setters here? So what is the outcome? Okay, Epic doesn't want to pay the 30%, but you know, what is the antitrust remedy here that we once said? And this is something that antitrust has been grappling with for a very long time, and I'm not sure we're going to have a satisfactory outcome. It is possible to have a satisfactory outcome in this case. Of course, the ultimate answer could be to have more app stores, right? Because now the situation is Epic or other game developers, they're stuck with two app stores ultimately when it comes to mobile. So can we achieve this? In Europe, we do have an answer to this, which is the DMA, but it is to be seen whether the DMA will actually have an impact of creating more app stores. So I suppose I am a believer in the DMA and its ability to create the so-called contestability, which could then achieve fairness. I'm misquoting the legislation here a little bit, but I think here the ultimate outcome is not, or maybe shouldn't be, like what the actual fee level should be, more that what other alternatives do developers have, coming back to the same point we were making earlier. And also, of course, one thing, again, I'm sure both Fabian and Eli have thought about this before, is the fact that Epic is a massive player. We're not talking about even though they pitched this like Spotify versus Apple a few years ago, they pitched this as like a small kind of, or smaller player against like a big evil giant. But it's Epic ultimately who's a very massive player in games. So I don't know. I suppose there are some questions to be asked about incentives, but I don't have the answers. So yeah, that's all.
And I think it's quite a common trend. The most successful contestants of the status quo in this DMA, DMCC games are usually quite, at least medium-sized industry players who have the vision and have also resources to do a systematic job in this regard. So it's probably a trend. Eli, what do you think about this case?
So first off, I guess, give me a moment for some American exceptionalism, that we get a 9-member jury, 9 random people who get to make a judgment on a lawsuit probably worth billions of dollars. So that's pretty wonderful. I say that somewhat ironically. But it's interesting because as you all point out, not just is Epic a big company, but they run their own store on PC. So they're looking to be a competitor to the Google Play Store. Essentially, a remedy wouldn't necessarily be governing fees provision, so you take 15% instead of 30. What they're trying to get is to open up the device so that you can load other app stores onto it, which already happens on PC. So on PC, you have the Windows Store, you have Steam for video games, you have the Epic Store, because they have their own, as I mentioned. And so an adequate remedy would be essentially allowing other companies to compete. Now, Google's terrified of that because then they would be forced to lower rates. And we've seen that happen on PC, because on PC, the rates are not 30% anymore. On PC, because it is an open environment, the rates, there's been a race to the bottom in sorts. And I think the average fee now is around 15%. So it's literally halved the fee on PC because there has been competition there. So it'll be interesting to see what happens on the Android devices in terms of remedies in that space. I also want to point out that with the Apple suit a few years ago, Epic did get one win, as you pointed out, with the alternate payment methods. But I think some people minimize how important that win is, because essentially what set off the lawsuit is that within Fortnite, they would let you buy something on the device on the phone, and then they would let you get it for cheaper if you went through the PC, because there was no fee there. And that's when the whole conflict sort of began. But although they did it intentionally to spur the conflict, it was sort of fabricated. And the fact that you can now pay through an alternative method on PC to save money to circumvent those fees, I think is actually a pretty significant win, because essentially a lot of developers, Spotify, for example, have concocted a system where you almost always go through your PC or another device to pay to avoid those fees. So it really created, I think, a significant loophole. So I wouldn't minimize the effect of that one win out of 10, because I do think it's pretty significant. But it'll be interesting to see where this goes. I mean, obviously, the next question is, okay, if Android is a walled garden, is Apple? I think most people would say maybe. I mean, if based off the logic of this first decision, but the more thorny questions come on to other platforms, right? So the Nintendo Switch, for example, 150 million people almost have the Nintendo Switch. They run their own shop on the Switch. Did the implications of this decision mean that now Nintendo has to let any app store onto its platform, even though its platform is pretty proprietary, even though Nintendo is sort of a company that tries to market itself as for everyone, not just for adults? What happens if there's adult content getting loaded on there through alternative means? I think that those questions are significantly more thorny than the ones about phone devices.
Which leads us perfect to a question which I wanted to ask you. It's being used quite often in different contexts, and I imagine that context matters a lot here. But maybe you can still formulate the trend. How convincing the counter-arguments of security and privacy of those who want to keep the gardens well are, in your view, Fabian?
Yeah, just two minor things to add before I get to that. As Ayşe said, probably Epic versus Google and is more like Goliath versus a giant. Like Epic isn't really the poor little company here. We know, but we do know on the other hand from the Google and the Apple cases that Google tried to pay video game publishers significant fees, like I think like up to 250 million per publisher, to not open competing app stores, because these in-game purchases are such a significant revenue source for both Apple and Google. So there's this big motivation behind that to actually prevent others from opening stores. So this may be very pro-competitive in the long term if they're opening up more stores. And then we obviously, as you said, then we might have that issue. What does get on the device? Like right now, Google and Apple are no longer policing what gets onto our devices through the respective stores. But if we think about the PCs, like, yes, more stuff is getting onto PCs than phones, but it's an open ecosystem. You can go into the internet and download anything you want. Essentially, I feel like there's more of like these kind of protection programs than as we already have for PCs, that we might get them for our phones, which is a business model that's clearly working for computers. I don't see how it couldn't work for phones. I think it's a bit of a lame excuse to just get around that, which also would introduce more competition. If you have different security mechanisms from your phone, that would open up the whole new market. So I think it's not something that can't be solved in the end.
Thank you very much. Ayşe, you mentioned also, maybe in the context of interoperability, this would be of particular relevance, this issue.
Yeah, exactly, Oles. I agree with you, Fabian, that it's a bit of a lame excuse to push security as a reason for not allowing more ecosystems to flourish. But one question that emerged from our discussions with virtual world builders was that if we allow for example, if we allow for interoperability, somebody has to put the security measures in place. So it comes with, you know, again, the underlying measures have to be run by someone, and who's gonna first of all, who's gonna undertake the you know, the financial burden of ensuring that in reality. And maybe, Fabian, you're right, I hadn't thought about that, but there could be, you know, antivirus systems like third parties emerging, so another business model coming out that will ensure that, you know, security is there when we open up platforms and we make them interoperate with one another. But yeah, this was certainly a concern in terms of, you know, who bears the cost of ensuring the security aspects of cross-platform interoperability. Another thing that is maybe relevant here in the context of virtual worlds is that this applies to not just, you know, security measures, but when we talk about interoperability in every way. So again, you know, if in terms of, for example, the interoperability of a sweater, like you buy a Gucci sweater on one platform, but you want to migrate it to another platform, and in that case, so for example, there are many questions about who bears the governance of IP rights. You know, there are a lot of there are contractual issues and especially IP issues that, you know, we don't see necessarily as the users that go on behind the curtains. And when we move anything from one platform to the other, the question is, you know, who bears the financial burden of running all that operation behind the scenes? It's not necessarily an issue for the users. As users, we don't realize this, and maybe we don't even care. When we, you know, come from the marketing aspect, the marketing expert we collaborated with was, you know, expressing that users don't care. They are used to signing on to different platforms. They don't necessarily worry about interoperability today, but, you know, somebody has to run the whole operation in the background.
Thank you, Eli. Yeah, I sort of agree a lot with what Ayşe and Fabian have said. I think I am not actually that concerned. I think, like Fabian said, that people sort of figure it out. We already have PCs that are open platforms, mostly, and Microsoft runs the background infrastructure, just as Google runs the background infrastructure of Android. And by and large, it's okay. I mean, there was a lot of time where viruses were an issue, but now there's antivirus software. A lot of it is up to the user. And for the vast majority of users that use PCs, as long as you're not opening shady emails, you're going to be okay, because you're not going to go outside of the bubble of safe content. You're going to download, you know, software from trusted sources, and it'll be by and large okay. And then there's the 1% of, probably even less than 1% of people that venture out into the unknown, and sometimes that becomes problems in terms of safety and security. But I don't really buy the concern, because the stuff that is the best tested, which is just regular software consumer products, that stuff isn't going to have issues in terms of safety and security. The people that play everyday video games aren't going to have issues. That's all going to be tested and ironed out. It's really the 1% of 1% of things that haven't been tested that become an issue. Essentially, Apple and Android's argument is that through their app store, they are confirming that every single thing on there almost is up to license certification and will not poison your device, will not present illegal activity or whatever it is, because they have to go through their certification system, and they're afraid of having that out of their hands. But yeah, I agree with the others, especially Fabian, that the concerns are not large for me.
Let me ask you also a question before asking our traditional one recommendations to students. I wanted to ask you. Obviously, this market is not homogeneous in terms of geographical dimension. We see that some jurisdictions or some countries are, or cultures perhaps, are maybe more advanced. Again, from stereotypical non-user perspective, in terms of this video gaming culture, they are definitely trendsetters. And I'm talking, maybe I don't mention them correctly, but Japan and South Korea are usually seen as those pioneers in many respects. Do we see some interesting regulatory solutions which these supposedly more advanced markets have figured out, which we can transpose effectively to our jurisdictions? Or is there any interesting development elsewhere which you wanted to mention as an interesting example, as a counterpoint maybe?
Yeah, I guess it kind of depends where we go and what we look at, because gaming isn't just gaming. Well, for instance, what I'm looking at as part of my PhD is esports and gaming. So esports is the competitive playing of video games. For that, South Korea has been the pioneer, as you said. For instance, they have a regulator, CASPA, which essentially deals with anything esports related, and they're putting out legislation that it's beneficial for all stakeholders, and they're looking that the playing field is more leveled between everyone. But then that's esports specific. If we look at, for instance, as part of my dissertation, I've identified 22 to 28 relevant markets in an esports and gaming ecosystem. So it doesn't just help us if there's something good in esports, then there are 27 other markets. I think we're placed quite well with the DMA, although we haven't yet realized it, because the big problem is video games aren't mentioned explicitly. So how can we fit them into the DMA? Do we fit them into the DMA one by one, or do we take a whole bundle of them? So for instance, we have looked at including video games in the DMA, either as an online social networking service, because it fits the definition, much like Facebook. You go to a video game, you interact socially. You just need to find a video game that has 45 million users and 10,000 business users. The business users are actually the lesser problem, because you have plenty of streamers and content creators out there. Probably in a heartbeat, most of the big games have those business users, but you need 45 million within the European Union. So as we already said earlier, talking about Game Pass could have 147 million users in the EU. So we could classify that as an online intermediation service. And I've run through the definition that completely works. So if we want to highlight any jurisdiction that's well placed, it's probably Europe. But then there's obviously some other jurisdiction that is better for the esports market, that has some other data protection rules, even though we're leading in Europe with that as well. But it's like, the market is so complex that there's not one jurisdiction that has this universal solution that addresses all the problems.
The market is so complex. I wanted to follow up question, Fabian. Don't you think that, or do you think that we've been too naive maybe with delineating core platform services so strictly, and now trying to somehow to squeeze the digital reality, digital activities into these boxes? Is UK approach more flexible and more realistic in your view?
Well, I think two approaches are more realistic and flexible. Germany with paragraph 19A, GWB, and the UK with its system as well. With the DMA, we said like, yeah, well, here's this exhaustive list, and now we have to put in everything in the definitions that don't quite fit, but we can make them work. In my personal opinion, I'm not a big fan of the DMA either way, because we're using old antitrust jurisprudence and calling it something different, but codifying it and saying it's regulation now suddenly, even though everyone knows it's antitrust law in its core. So I think definitely Germany and the UK have a better solution in that regard.
In that regard, or more generally as well? In the DMA regard, more generally, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, for gaming, yes, and also I think the UK system and 19A are more effective in addressing gatekeepers. Obviously, you have the conflict between 19A and the DMA in the long term.
Thank you very much. Ayşe, what do you think? Maybe you can bring to us some interesting examples.
So two points. One is one thing we heard a lot in our conversations with industry participants was that this sector should not be regulated as social media because it has very distinct features. Even though that's currently we talked about this at a superficial level, it's definitely one of the things we're going to explore. But I mean, on the face of it, it's absolutely true. I mean, it's social. The socializing is a major component, but it's just one component of the gaming sector. In that sense, of course, the DMA has quite narrow, market, core platform service definitions. But I think I don't disagree with this approach because each of the delineated core platform services, they're distinct in their features, and I think I think that's the right approach. The question is, of course, one thing I agree with Fabian about is that it's very much flowing from past antitrust action, and there's a huge question about, is it too late? I mean, a lot of these undertakings are already entrenched. So is the DMA going to come in and make any kind of difference? So the question is, maybe we should put in there some services that are not there, but that are emerging just as a safeguard, so that if gatekeepers emerge in other sectors, then we can move in and treat this quicker than antitrust action that takes place over sometimes more than a decade. So I definitely agree with you on that score, Fabian. One thing that I'm going to say about regulation, again, this is something we heard from you, especially the UK sector, is that there's a lack of talent, and the regulatory change that people want is when it comes to immigration rules, which is something we weren't expecting at all. But this was also connected. I'm mentioning this because this was also connected to an expected rise in the use of artificial intelligence in the industry, because AI is at least expected to make it easier to first, develop at least a base, and then to be improved with basically human oversight and basically by developers. So at least in terms of when we started talking about how AI is or might change, is going to or might change the industry, that was one point that was underscored, connected to a lack of talent, and maybe, how can immigration rules change to bring more talent into the UK in the gaming industry?
I guess one thing I would point out that we haven't talked about before is the fact that free-to-play games now, which are games that are free to download and then usually charge you $1 or $2 in microtransactions while you play them, those are at this point now the largest types of games in terms of revenue. Even though they're free, they make the most money, and those are predominant in especially non-developed countries where people have high ownership of phones, but not necessarily good computer devices or game console hardware. So we're seeing that being huge in China, but now it's essentially increasing in domination across the world. I mean, American children are playing increasingly on handheld devices. And so that's the only thing I would add in terms of differences regionally, is that in America, we still have a large number of people that are buying games a la carte at $60, $70 each for their platforms, and that is not something you see all around the world anymore.
Thank you very much. And now let us move to this the most rewarding part of the series, where we ask the guests to provide their sincere, collegial, friendly recommendations for those students maybe who just graduated and embark on this journey, trying to learn about antitrust and digital markets. What would be your recommendation? Let us start again with you, Fabian.
I would say see or follow where your passion takes you. For me, I was a gamer, and at some point during my master's at the LSE was like, how can I actually combine those two things? Like for me, antitrust law was always interesting, but there was nothing that I like really had this fire for. That's what I want to go into. That's what I want to do for like 5-10 years, the rest of my life, who knows? And once I combined my passion for gaming with antitrust and IP law, what I've been doing academically, there emerged a master's thesis and now a PhD, and then who knows what comes next. Like, just follow what you enjoy, and then everything else falls into place, I would say.
Thank you very much, Ayşe.
I couldn't agree more, but what drew me to antitrust was basically the intellectual challenge that each case presented, because you can't just get away with knowing the law. You have to understand each sector. And I have to admit that gaming is completely new to me. So I'm still, I'm still feeling I'm on shaky ground, but I'm really, really interested in the virtual world development. So this is why I'm here. But one thing I can say is that it's never just about antitrust. When you go into this world, you have to pick up copyright. You have to pick up other types of IP. You have to pick up data protection, which is massively emerging now when we talk about, how to use AI and LLMs, large language models when we develop games. So you don't think that you can just stay limited to antitrust. You're going to have to learn about a lot of different legal systems and jurisdictions as well. But that's what makes it super interesting.
Thank you very much, Ayşe. Eli?
Yeah, so since I graduated recently, I don't think my advice will be too useful, but the one thing I will say is I encourage people to think outside the box. Here in America, we've had our antitrust system more or less paralyzed for 40 years under the consumer welfare standard, and what we're now seeing is an increasing number of thinkers who want to change the direction of the law and the way that we think about antitrust. I mean, in America, the problem is that our two integral pieces of antitrust legislation were both written in essentially the 1890s. And since then, we've been reinterpreting the same, 50 words of text that were written in the laws. So that allows for a lot of leeway, a lot of ambiguity. And so I really encourage people to hopefully break free from the traditional understandings in the way that it's been interpreted, especially when you have a medium like gaming, which is really innovative and new. It's going to require new strategies, and it requires thinking outside the box.
Thank you very much. Fabian Ziermann, Ayşe, Gizem, Yasar, Eli Pales, thank you very much indeed for this stimulating conversation. It was a pleasure to having you today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thank
It
you
was a
very
pleasure.
much.